Damascus, Syria, the 14th day of September, 1260. The stone floor of the citadel's underground chamber gleams wet in lamplight, not from water. A woman kneels in the center of the room, hands bound behind her back with silk cord. The silk is a deliberate choice. It leaves no marks. Her name is Catherine of Acre, 23 years old, daughter of a Frankish merchant who made the mistake of believing his trading contracts would protect his family when the Mamluk armies arrived at the city gates 3 months earlier. She is not alone. 17 other women line the walls, standing with their backs pressed against cold limestone. They range in age from 14 to 42, all Christian, all captured during the same campaign, all waiting to discover which of the 3 doors in this chamber they will be taken through. Each door leads to a different fate. The women do not yet know what those fates are, but they have learned enough in the past 90 days to understand that the Mamluks approach human acquisition with the same systematic precision they apply to military conquest. A man enters through the center door. He carries no weapons. He wears the simple robe of a royal steward, but the deference shown to him by the guards reveals his true authority. His name is Amir Tashtamur, and his role within Sultan Baybar's administration is one that most histories prefer to forget. He oversees the integration of captured populations into the Mamluk economic and social structure. Integration is the word used in official documents. The reality contains layers of calculation that would take hours to fully comprehend. Tashtamur walks past Catherine without looking at her. He stops in front of a younger woman, perhaps 16, with the distinctive features that mark her as Armenian rather than Frankish. He speaks to her in Arabic. She does not understand. He repeats himself in Armenian. Her face drains of color. She shakes her head. He nods to a guard, who takes her arm and leads her toward the left door. The door opens. Through it, Catherine glimpses a courtyard, where dozens of women sit in rows, heads bowed, while other men in official robes examine them with the practiced efficiency of livestock merchants evaluating breeding stock. The door closes. Tashtamur continues down the line. His selections follow patterns that become clear to Catherine as she watches. Age matters. Origin matters. Physical condition matters most of all. But there is something else he evaluates, something less tangible. He asks each woman a question in her native language. The question varies, but the underlying test remains constant. He is measuring their capacity for transformation. The Mamluks built an empire on transformation. They themselves were transformed from enslaved boys into the most formidable military force of their era. They understand, with ruthless clarity, that human beings can be systematically reshaped given the right combination of time, technique, and total control over environment. What they did to captured women was not random violence. It was engineered conversion, the deliberate destruction and reconstruction of identity according to precise specifications that served economic, political, and social functions within their expanding state. Tonight, you will discover what that systematic transformation involved, the specific procedures, the calculated timeframes, the infrastructure built to process thousands of women annually, the psychological techniques that broke resistance without leaving visible damage, the markets that distributed human beings across 3 continents, the detailed records that tracked every transaction, and the individual stories of women whose names survived in sources that official histories tried to erase. This is not the sanitized version taught in schools. This is not the romanticized harem fantasy of Orientalist paintings. This is the documented reality of what happened when one of history's most sophisticated military empires applied its organizational genius to the systematic exploitation of captured populations. Before we continue, understand that what follows is disturbing. It is meant to be. These women existed. Their suffering was real. Their stories deserve to be told without the comfortable distance that centuries provide. If you want the truth about medieval power, conquest, and what systematic oppression actually looked like when implemented by brilliant administrators. You need to hear this. Hit the subscribe button to support a fellow history enthusiast, and drop a comment with your location. I'm genuinely curious to see how far these stories reach. Now, let us return to that chamber beneath the Damascus citadel and discover what happened when Emir Tashtamur finally stopped in front of Catherine of Acre. To understand what Catherine faced, you must first grasp the nature of the Mamluk state itself. The Mamluks were not born to power. They purchased it. Every sultan, every emir, every commander who shaped the medieval Middle East began life as a slave. Young boys, typically captured from Turkic tribes in Central Asia or Circassian communities in the Caucasus, were bought by Egyptian and Syrian rulers and subjected to intensive military and religious training. By their 20s, these former slaves had become elite warriors. By their 30s, many held positions of command, and when the Ayyubid dynasty collapsed in 1250, it was a Mamluk who seized the throne. This created a paradox at the heart of their society. The ruling class consisted entirely of men who had been enslaved, trained, and transformed into something new. They viewed transformation through bondage not as atrocity, but as proven methodology. If boys could be systematically converted into warriors, then surely captured populations could be systematically converted into whatever the state required. And the state required much. The Mamluk Sultanate, at its height, controlled Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Western Arabia. It defended Islam against Mongol invasion from the east and Crusader encroachment from the west. It managed the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It dominated Mediterranean trade. This vast administrative and military apparatus demanded constant replenishment of human resources at every level: soldiers, servants, artisans, laborers, concubines. The systematic acquisition and processing of captured peoples became as essential to Mamluk survival as tax collection or grain storage. The infrastructure they built to manage this would impress modern logisticians. Damascus alone contained 7 major processing centers by the late 13th century. These were not prisons. They were transformation facilities, each designed for specific categories of captives. The citadel complex where Catherine waited held high-value acquisitions, individuals whose background, education, or physical attributes marked them for specialized placement. Other facilities handled volume processing, converting thousands of war captives into the labor force that built roads, maintained irrigation, and staffed the growing cities. The system operated with documented efficiency. Contemporary sources describe standardized procedures, medical examination within 24 hours of arrival, classification based on age, origin, physical condition, and assessed capability, assignment to transformation track, initial processing period of 60 to 90 days, final placement. Records tracked each individual through the system, losses were calculated, productivity was measured. The Mamluks approached human acquisition with the same systematic thinking they applied to military campaigns. But women presented unique considerations. Male captives offered straightforward utility, labor, military service for those deemed suitable, craft work for those with skills. The pathways were clear. Women required more complex calculation. Their value derived from multiple functions simultaneously: reproductive capacity, domestic service, status signaling, economic exchange, and something else. Something that records document but modern sensibilities struggle to process without flinching: cultural erasure as demonstration of conquest. When Mamluk armies took Christian territories, they were not simply acquiring land. They were eliminating rival power structures. Christian communities in Syria, Palestine, and Armenia had maintained distinct identities for centuries. They had their own churches, their own laws, their own marriage, customs. They represented alternative sources of loyalty, potential resistance, future rebellion. The systematic integration of their women into Mamluk households served multiple purposes simultaneously. It removed the next generation of Christians from the population. It demonstrated total victory. It provided tangible reward to soldiers and officers. It generated revenue through slave markets. And it destroyed community cohesion more effectively than any massacre. This was policy, not chaos. Contemporary administrative documents reveal the calculation behind it. Regulations govern the distribution of captives. Officers received first selection based on rank. Common soldiers received assigned shares. The state claimed a fifth of all acquisitions. Local governors could purchase captives at fixed rates. Markets handled surplus. The entire system operated under legal frameworks derived from interpretations of Islamic law regarding prisoners of war and slavery. The women caught in this system faced transformation procedures, refined over decades of practice. The Mamluks had learned from experience what methods worked, how to break resistance without destroying utility, how to erase previous identity while building new compliance, how to maximize economic return while maintaining social control. They had developed techniques that combined psychological manipulation with physical constraint, always calculated to achieve specific outcomes. Catherine of Acre, kneeling on that wet stone floor, was about to experience the culmination of this systematic thinking. When Emir Tashtamur stopped in front of Catherine, he asked his question in Frankish French. His accent was perfect. This detail matters. The Mamluks did not merely conquer, they studied. They learned the languages of their enemies. They understood Christian social structures well enough to exploit them. "Can you read?" he asked. Catherine hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, she made a decision that would determine everything that followed. She could lie, claim ignorance, hope that illiteracy might make her less valuable, might lead to assignment to some less terrible fate than whatever awaited educated captives. But something in Tashtamur's eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Her father had been a merchant. Merchants taught their children to read. Lying would only demonstrate that she lacked judgment. "Yes," she said. "French and Latin, some Arabic." Tashtamur's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture. He gestured to a guard, who brought a wooden tablet covered in wax. On it, someone had written a sentence in Arabic script. Tashtamur held it toward Catherine. "Read this," he commanded. She studied the words. The script was formal, classical, a line from religious poetry. She read it aloud, slowly, her pronunciation uncertain but comprehensible. Tashtamur took the tablet back. He made a mark on the parchment he carried. Then he moved to the next woman without another word. Catherine did not know it yet, but she had just been selected for the right door, not the left, which led to the processing courtyard and eventual distribution to military households as domestic servants, not the center, which led to immediate sale in the Damascus slave market. The right door led to something else entirely, a transformation track reserved for a specific category of captive, women who possessed education, linguistic ability, or other skills that made them suitable for placement in administrative households. This sounds almost merciful until you understand what administrative household placement actually meant. 3 days later, Catherine was taken through that right door. She found herself in a different kind of chamber, smaller than the first, its walls covered with carpets that muffled sound. 5 other women waited there, all selected by the same criteria, all educated, all multilingual, all young enough to be malleable. An older woman entered. Her name was Sophia, and she had once been exactly where Catherine now stood. 20 years earlier, she had been captured during a raid on Armenian territory. She had been processed through the same system. She had survived the same transformation. Now, she served as instructor for new acquisitions, deemed suitable for specialized placement. What Sophia taught over the next 60 days was systematic erasure paired with systematic reconstruction. The first week focused on language, not learning Arabic, though that continued. Rather, forgetting how to speak in ways that signaled Christian identity. Certain phrases had to be eliminated from their vocabulary. References to Christian prayer, appeals to saints, even the casual invocations that Christians used without thinking. God willing was acceptable. Christ preserve us was not. Sophia listened to their conversations with each other, correcting, always correcting, until the linguistic markers of their former faith vanished from their speech. The second week addressed body memory, how they moved, how they held themselves. Christian women carried themselves differently than Muslim women of equivalent social status. The differences were subtle, but visible to trained observers. Posture, gesture, the way they lowered their eyes or failed to. The transformation required rebuilding these physical habits from the foundation. They practiced for hours each day, walking, sitting, standing, responding to commands. The repetition was deliberate. The body needed to forget its previous patterns before new ones could take root. The third week introduced household management. Not cooking or cleaning, tasks that lower status captives learned. Administrative household placement meant managing other servants, maintaining account books, handling correspondence for women of the household who might not be literate themselves. Catherine's ability to read and write became her primary function. She learned the specific formats used in Mamluk administrative documents, the proper forms of address, the hierarchies that governed every interaction. The fourth week brought the most difficult lessons. These were the transformations that could not be practiced, only explained and prepared for. Sophia spoke with clinical precision about what would be expected in the household where Catherine would eventually be placed. The nature of access that male household members would have, the responses that were required. The absolute necessity of compliance presented not as moral instruction, but as survival strategy. Resistance is waste, Sophia explained, her voice devoid of emotion. The household has invested in your acquisition and training. Resistance damages that investment. Damaged investments are discarded. You have seen the markets. You understand what discard means. Catherine had seen the markets during her first week in Damascus, a brief excursion that served as object lesson more than orientation. The lower-tier markets, where damaged goods were sold at deep discount. Women whose resistance had marked them as untrainable. Women whose physical damage made them unsuitable for anything except the hardest labor. Women who would be worked until they died, a process that typically took between 2 and 5 years, according to the mortality calculations that administrators tracked with the same precision they tracked grain harvests. The message was clear. Submit to transformation or be transformed into something even worse. By the 8th week, Catherine barely recognized herself. She moved differently. She spoke differently. She thought differently. The constant reinforcement had created new patterns that felt almost natural. When she caught her reflection in the polished bronze mirror that hung in the training chamber, she saw someone who could pass for a woman born into a Mamluk administrative household. Someone who belonged. This was the goal. Not mere compliance, but internalized identity shift. The Mamluks understood something that modern psychology would not articulate for centuries. Given sufficient time and total control over environment, human identity is far more malleable than most people believe. Catherine had not been broken. She had been rebuilt. The 9th week brought her placement. The household of Emir Kalawan occupied an entire district block in Damascus. Kalawan would eventually become Sultan, though in 1260 he was merely one of Sultan Baybars's most trusted commanders. His household reflected his rising status. 37 soldiers, 18 administrative staff, 43 domestic servants, and 11 women in the harem section, each with their own rank and function within the household hierarchy. Catherine arrived in a closed sedan chair, accompanied by Sophia and 2 guards. The transfer was documented. Papers changed hands. Payment was recorded. She had cost Kalawan 600 dirhams, a substantial sum that reflected her assessed value. Educated, trilingual, trained in administrative household management. The investment carried expectations. Sophia departed immediately after the transfer. Catherine never saw her again. Years later, Catherine would wonder if Safiya felt anything during those departures, handing over women she had spent months training to households where their fates would unfold beyond her sight. Or if the transformation process that had reshaped Catherine had first reshaped Safiya so thoroughly that such transfers had become merely transactions, as mechanical as recording ledger entries. The head of Kalawun's harem was a woman named Zara. She was not a captive. She was Kalawun's first wife, married when they were both young, before his military career elevated him to command rank. She ran the women's quarters with efficiency that matched any military commander's management of troops. Every woman had a function. Every function supported the household's operation. Hierarchy was absolute. Catherine's function was correspondence management. The women of prominent Mamluk households maintained extensive social networks through written communication, marriage negotiations, gift exchanges, political intelligence. All of this required someone who could write in multiple languages, who understood formal composition, who could be trusted with sensitive information. Catherine's training made her perfect for this role. For the first month, the work was exactly as described. She sat in a small room off the main harem courtyard, writing letters as dictated by Zara or the two other senior wives. The content was mundane. Invitations, thank you notes, inquiries about silk merchants. She wrote in beautiful script on expensive paper. She sealed the letters with wax. She filed copies in the household records. The work was boring. Boring was safety. Boring meant her value derived from skills that would remain useful for years. Boring meant the investment in her training would be protected. This lasted until Kalawun's third son turned 18, and his father decided it was time to complete his education in all matters that a man of rank needed to understand. The system had a term for this. The sources record it without commentary. Young men of military households were expected to learn governance, warfare, and what was called household management. Household management included intimate knowledge that could not be acquired from wives of equivalent status. The solution was systematic. Junior wives, or specifically designated servants, provided this education. The practice was common enough that it generated no scandal. It was simply how things worked in households that could afford multiple women. Catherine learned she had been selected for this function on a Thursday evening when Zara summoned her to the courtyard after the final prayer. Zara explained with the same clinical precision that Safiya had used. This was an honor. This reflected confidence in Catherine's training. This demonstrated that she had successfully integrated into the household. Resistance would indicate failed training and result in reassignment. Reassignment meant the lower markets, Catherine remembered. What followed over the next 3 years was systematic. Kalawun's son visited her quarters twice weekly on a fixed schedule. The encounters followed patterns that had been explained to her during her training. She was expected to be compliant, but not enthusiastic, responsive, but not initiating, present, but somehow absent. The emotional disconnection was the point. These were not relationships. They were educational procedures. Catherine developed the dissociation techniques that women in her position had developed for generations. The ability to observe herself from outside, to be present in body while sending her consciousness elsewhere. She perfected the art of performing required responses while thinking about letter composition, about Arabic grammar, about anything except what was actually happening in that small room twice each week. The Mamluks had calculated this too. They understood that women in such positions needed psychological survival mechanisms. They did not discourage dissociation. They encouraged it. Women who could mentally separate themselves from physical experience were more durable, more sustainable, better long-term investments. The system preferred women who could endure indefinitely over women who broke quickly and required replacement. During the day, Catherine continued her correspondence work. She became extraordinarily skilled. Her calligraphy was admired throughout Damascus. She could compose in 4 languages with equal facility. She managed sensitive negotiations regarding marriage alliances with a diplomatic subtlety that impressed even Zahra. Her value increased year by year. At night, Twice weekly, she reported to the small room and performed the function for which she had also been acquired. The duality was the system working exactly as designed. Women who provided multiple forms of value simultaneously represented optimal return on investment. Catherine was correspondence clerk and educational resource both. Her literacy made her useful during daylight hours. Her controlled availability made her useful during designated evening hours. She was, from the household management perspective, a success story of the acquisition and training process. From Catherine's perspective, she was surviving, month by month, year by year. She learned not to count the days. Counting made time feel endless. Instead, she marked time by external events, when Kalawun became Sultan in 1279, when his son married and stopped requiring her educational services, when she was assigned to train a newly acquired Armenian girl in correspondence management. That last assignment broke something in her that 3 years of systematic exploitation had failed to touch. Looking at the Armenian girl, freshly processed through the transformation system, seeing her own past reflected in terrified eyes, Catherine realized she had become Safia. She was now the instructor, the one who would train the next acquisition to accept what Catherine had accepted, the one who would explain with clinical precision what functions the girl would perform. She could not do it. If you're still listening, comment number 1 below to let me know you're here, and subscribe to the channel to show me your support if you haven't already. Now let's continue. The household maintained a tradition that senior members could petition the Sultan directly during the weekly public audience. This was a legitimizing practice, a way for the ruling Mamluks to demonstrate their accessibility despite their absolute power. Most petitions were mundane: tax disputes, inheritance claims, commercial disagreements. They were heard, decided, recorded. Catherine attended these audiences as part of her administrative duties. She took notes on petitions for the household records. She had done this dozens of times. No one paid attention to her. She was furniture. Another piece of the vast administrative apparatus that kept the Mamluk state functioning. On the 3rd day of October, 1284, Catherine stood during a pause in petitions and spoke directly to Sultan Kalawun. The chamber went silent. Women did not speak at public audiences unless specifically called upon. Certainly not women from the harem section of households. Certainly not about their own situations. The violation of protocol was shocking enough that the guards did not immediately stop her. Catherine spoke in perfect Arabic. She had rehearsed this for weeks. I petition for manumission on the grounds that I have served the Emir's household with distinction for 12 years, have provided valued services including the training of his staff, and have performed all required functions without resistance or complaint. I request transfer to the status of freed servant with continued employment in the correspondence office. The petition was legally sound. Islamic law regarding slavery included provisions for manumission after long service, particularly for enslaved persons who had demonstrated exceptional utility and compliance. Catherine had researched extensively. She had found precedents. She had documented her own value through the correspondence records she had maintained. She had also done something unprecedented. Enslaved women did not petition for their own freedom. They certainly did not do so in public audience, where refusing the petition would require Kalawun to publicly explain why a woman who claimed to have served faithfully for 12 years did not deserve consideration. The calculation was deliberate. The setting was tactical. The legal framework was solid. Catherine had applied everything she had learned about Mamluk administration, about Islamic jurisprudence, about household hierarchy, to construct a petition that was difficult to refuse without appearing unjust. Kalawun stared at her for a long moment. His face revealed nothing. Then he turned to his chief Qadi, the Islamic judge who advised on legal matters. "Is this petition legally formulated?" he asked. The Qadi reviewed the precedents Catherine had cited. He checked them against his own records. Finally, he nodded. "The petition is sound," he confirmed. Manumission after faithful service is prescribed. The petitioner has documented her service. The household has benefited from her labor. The legal requirements are satisfied. Kalawun could have refused anyway. Sultanic authority superseded legal niceties when necessary. But refusing would have implications. It would suggest that faithful service meant nothing, that the legal frameworks he claimed to uphold were empty formalities, that the Mamluk state, built on systematic transformation and earned advancement, did not actually reward merit. He granted the petition. Catherine was freed that afternoon. The documentation was prepared. The official seal was applied. She was transferred to paid employment in the correspondence office at a salary of 12 dirhams per month. She was assigned a small room in the administrative wing of the compound. She was no longer anyone's property. The cost was everything else. She could never return to Acre. The Frankish territories were gone, conquered. Her family was dead or scattered. She had no community except the Mamluk system, in which she had been embedded for over a decade. She had no identity except the one that had been built during those 60 days of training. She was free in a technical sense, but freedom meant only that she could not be sold. She still lived in the same household. She still performed the same work. She still existed entirely within the structure that had acquired and transformed her. But she had chosen. That mattered. The petition had been her decision. The words had been her composition. The outcome had resulted from her action. After 12 years of having every moment dictated, every function assigned, every response required, she had exercised agency. The victory was microscopic, but real, and the Armenian girl she had refused to train was transferred to a different household where someone else completed the process Catherine had started. This haunted her more than anything that had been done to her. The girl had been reassigned because Catherine had failed to perform her instructional duties. Had the reassignment led to better or worse circumstances? Catherine would never know. The not knowing was its own punishment, a reminder that even her rebellion had consequences she could not control. While Catherine's story followed one track through the Mamluk acquisition system, thousands of other women moved through different pathways. The most direct pathway was the slave market. Damascus hosted 3 major markets during the period of Mamluk expansion, each specialized in different categories of human merchandise. The northern market handled bulk acquisition from military campaigns. This was where prisoners of war were processed immediately after capture. The market operated with brutal efficiency. Captives were examined. Prices were set based on age, physical condition, and origin. Soldiers and officers made their purchases. The transactions were completed within days. This was the pathway for the majority of Christian women captured during Mamluk expansion into Crusader territories. A woman named Isabella of Tripoli passed through the northern market in the summer of 1289. She was 38 years old when Mamluk forces took Tripoli, older than the premium age for acquisition but healthy and experienced in household management. She had managed her husband's estate before the siege. This experience gave her residual value, even at an age when younger women commanded higher prices. The examination in the northern market was humiliating but brief. She was required to stand in a line with 40 other women from Tripoli. Prospective buyers walked past, asking questions, occasionally requesting that a woman demonstrate her teeth or her hands. Isabella was purchased by a minor military officer for 200 dirhams, a mid-range price that reflected her age balanced against her evident capabilities. Her purchaser was not cruel. This is important to understand. He was simply operating within a system where human acquisition was normal commercial activity. He needed someone to manage his household. His wife had died 6 months earlier. He had 3 children who required supervision. Isabella, with her demonstrated household management experience, fit his requirements exactly. She was taken to his residence that same afternoon. The transfer was matter of fact. He showed her the kitchen, the children's rooms, the courtyard where laundry was done. He explained her duties, which were extensive but comprehensible. Cook, clean, manage the other servants, 2 younger women who handled heavy labor, ensure the children were fed, clothed, educated. In any other context, this would have been employment. Isabella had performed similar work in Tripoli. The fundamental difference was that she could not leave, could not negotiate terms, could not demand payment beyond food and shelter. The distinction between service and servitude was not in the labor itself, but in the total absence of alternative options. Isabella adapted because adaptation was survival. She cooked meals using ingredients that were subtly different from what she had used in Tripoli. She learned Arabic by necessity, picking it up from the children and the other servants. She managed the household with the same competence she had demonstrated in her previous life, because competence earned a measure of security. The officer appreciated her efficiency. He was even kind in his way, allowing her extra food during holidays, never striking her even when mistakes were made. From his perspective, he had made a good purchase. The household ran smoothly. The children were well cared for. The return on his 200 dirham investment was excellent. From Isabella's perspective, every moment of every day was service to the people who had destroyed her city, killed her husband, and scattered her own children to fates she would never know. But expressing that perspective served no purpose. She learned to bury it beneath the performance of competence. She survived 18 years in that household. When the officer died, his eldest son inherited her along with the other household assets. She continued the same work for the next generation. She became, in her way, a piece of permanent infrastructure, as embedded in the household as the stone walls or the olive trees in the courtyard. The market had processed her efficiently. She had been assigned. She had adapted. The system worked exactly as designed. Not all captured women passed through public markets. A specialized trade existed for specific categories of acquisition: women with rare skills, women of notable beauty by the aesthetic standards of the era, women from particularly prestigious families whose captivity served symbolic purposes. These entered a different pathway. The merchant quarter of Cairo contained establishments that handled such trade. These were not open-air markets, but private residences where carefully curated inventories were shown to select clients. The merchants who operated these establishments maintained networks across the Mamluk territories, paying agents to identify premium acquisitions before they reached public markets. A woman named Eleanor of Antioch entered this specialized trade in 1287. She was 19 years old, daughter of a minor Crusader nobleman whose family had held lands in Syria for 3 generations. When Mamluk forces took their fortress, Eleanor's father was killed in the fighting. Eleanor and her 2 sisters were captured alive. The capturing commander recognized their potential value. Crusader nobility commanded premium prices in the specialized trade. He sent word to a merchant in Cairo named Rashid ibn Ahmad, who maintained an establishment that catered to the highest tier of Mamluk society. Rashid sent an agent who negotiated directly with the commander. The transaction was completed before the sisters ever saw a public market. They were transported to Cairo in relative comfort. This was calculated preservation of merchandise value. Damage from travel would reduce price. They traveled in covered wagons with adequate food and water. They were not mistreated. Mistreatment would show. Rashid's establishment occupied a large residence near the citadel. The ground floor held administrative offices. The second floor contained training rooms where new acquisitions learned the presentation skills required for premium sale. The third floor housed the women currently in inventory. Eleanor and her sisters were taken to the third floor and assigned to private chambers. Over the next 4 months, they received training that was more intensive than what Catherine experienced. Premium acquisitions required premium presentation, language instruction, deportment training, musical skills, conversational arts. The goal was to transform captured Crusader nobility into women who could hold sophisticated conversations with the scholars and administrators who formed the highest tier of Mamluk society. The training was not optional, but neither was it brutal. Rashid understood that damaged merchandise lost value. His method was patient, systematic refinement. Each day brought lessons. Each week brought assessments. Progress was monitored. Gaps were addressed. By the end of 4 months, Eleanor could converse in Arabic with educated facility, could play the oud competently, could demonstrate the social graces expected in elite households. She was then presented to potential buyers during private showings. These were elaborate affairs. Rashid would host a dinner for a select client. After the meal, Eleanor and 2 or 3 other premium acquisitions would be brought to the reception room. They would demonstrate their accomplishments, play music, recite poetry, converse on literary or philosophical topics. The buyers could observe their presentation skills, their poise, their training. Eleanor was purchased by a senior administrative official for 1,000 dirhams, a price that reflected both her noble origin and her successful training. She was taken to a household where her function was primarily social. She attended gatherings of elite women, representing the household's status through her accomplishments and conversation. She was decorative in a sense, but decorative in the way that fine art is decorative. Her value derived from the cultivation and sophistication she could demonstrate. Her sisters followed similar pathways. One was purchased by a wealthy merchant who appreciated educated conversation partners. The other entered the household of a senior military commander. Both commanded premium prices. Both were treated relatively well by the standards of the system. Both lived comfortable lives, materially speaking. Yet all 3 existed in the same fundamental condition as Isabella in her officer's household or Catherine in her correspondence office. They could not choose differently. They could not leave. They could not determine the basic parameters of their own existence. The comfort was real. The accomplishment was real. The total absence of self-determination was equally real. The specialized trade represented the system's highest tier, the most refined expression of acquisition and transformation. It proved that the Mamluk approach to captured populations could produce results that satisfied even the most discriminating buyers. Eleanor, with her musical skills and philosophical conversation, was a success story of systematic human refinement. She was also a 19-year-old girl torn from her family and systematically reshaped into a product. Not every captured woman adapted successfully to the transformation process. Some resisted. The system had developed specific responses to resistance, responses that were documented in administrative records with the same clinical detail applied to successful integrations. A woman named Marguerite of Jerusalem attempted escape 3 times during her initial processing period. She was 26 when captured, old enough to have developed a fixed sense of identity that proved resistant to the transformation techniques. She had been married, had borne 2 children, had lived independently. The psychological techniques that worked on younger captives failed to reshape her fundamental self-conception. Her first escape attempt came during her 2nd week in the Damascus Processing Center. She climbed a wall during the exercise period and made it 3 streets before guards caught her. She was returned to the facility and placed in isolation for 7 days. Isolation was standard response to escape attempts. Removal of all social contact, minimal food, complete sensory deprivation, except for twice daily visits from instructors who explained the consequences of continued resistance. After 7 days, Marguerite was returned to the general population. She resumed training. She appeared compliant. 2 weeks later, she attempted escape again. This time, she made it to the Christian quarter of Damascus before being caught. The punishment escalated. 20 days of isolation, reduction in food rations, extended questioning sessions where administrators attempted to understand what motivated her resistance. The questioning revealed something that the records document with surprising honesty. Marguerite believed her children might still be alive. She had not seen them killed during the capture of Jerusalem. She thought perhaps they had survived, perhaps they had been taken somewhere else. Perhaps if she could escape, she could find them. The administrators used this information strategically. They told her that continued escape attempts would mark her as untrainable. Untrainable acquisitions were sold to hard labor operations. Women sent to hard labor typically died within 2 years. If her children were alive and were searching for her, they would never find a corpse in a limestone quarry. But if she completed her training, accepted placement, and survived, there remained a possibility, however remote, that she might one day encounter information about her children's fate. This was manipulation of the cruelest precision. They offered hope as a tool of compliance. The hope was almost certainly false. The children were almost certainly dead. But the possibility, however microscopic, was sufficient to alter Marguerite's calculation. She stopped attempting escape. She did not, however, become successfully compliant. She completed the required training but remained resistant in subtle ways. She spoke Arabic with deliberately poor pronunciation. She performed tasks adequately but never excellently. She demonstrated the minimum acceptable effort in all areas. This was passive resistance, the kind of resistance that administrators noted but tolerated because it did not disrupt operations as dramatically as escape attempts. She was eventually placed in a mid-tier household as a general servant. The placement reflected her assessed value. She could perform basic tasks, but would never demonstrate the excellence that marked premium acquisitions. Her sale price was 300 dirhams, middle of the market. The household where she was placed was not particularly harsh. The work was hard, but not impossible. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. The same domestic labor that women throughout history have performed. The difference was that Marguerite performed it while maintaining an internal identity separate from the role imposed upon her. She remained Marguerite of Jerusalem in her own conception, even as her body performed the functions of a Mamluk household servant. This internal resistance was its own form of survival. It was also its own form of suffering. Maintaining dual identity required constant psychological effort. Every task performed was a reminder that her body did things herself rejected. Every day was an exercise in cognitive dissonance. She survived, but at tremendous mental cost. 23 years later, when she was 49 years old, Marguerite encountered a Christian merchant in the Damascus market. He was one of the few remaining Christians who maintained trading privileges under Mamluk rule. She approached him during a moment when her overseers were distracted. She asked if he had ever heard of 2 children from Jerusalem, names and descriptions provided. He had not, but he made inquiries on her behalf over the following months. Eventually, he learned that children matching those descriptions had been recorded as casualties during the Jerusalem siege. They had died decades earlier. Marguerite had maintained her resistance, her internal identity, her hope for 23 years, based on a possibility that had ended before she ever entered the Damascus processing center. The merchant, moved by her situation, offered to purchase her freedom. By this point, she was too old to command significant value. He negotiated a price of 50 dirhams. She was manumitted at age 50. She lived 4 more years as a freed woman, working in the merchant's household as paid labor. She died in 1234, 38 years after her capture. The merchant ensured she was buried in a Christian cemetery with her birth name on the marker, Marguerite of Jerusalem. Not the name assigned to her during processing, not the identity they had attempted to impose. Her original name, a final assertion of resistance. The Mamluk acquisition system operated for over 2 centuries. Tens of thousands of Christian women passed through its various pathways. The effects extended beyond individual stories into generational transformation of entire populations. A woman named Anna was born in Damascus in 1320. Her mother had been captured during a raid into Armenian territory 15 years earlier. Her father was the Mamluk officer who had purchased her mother. Anna's existence was the direct product of the acquisition system, a second-generation effect. Anna's legal status at birth was complex. Islamic law held that children born to enslaved mothers inherited their mother's status. Anna was technically born into servitude. However, Mamluk practice often deviated from strict legal interpretation. Officers who fathered children with enslaved women frequently manumitted both mother and child, legitimizing the offspring. Anna's father followed this practice. He freed Anna's mother when Anna was born. He acknowledged Anna as his daughter. She was raised in his household with the same privileges as children born to free wives, though her position remained ambiguous in ways that would shape her entire life. She was educated. She learned to read and write. She studied religious texts. She was, by any objective measure, a woman of privilege within Mamluk society. Yet she carried knowledge that her mother had been captured, had been enslaved, had been transformed through systematic processes before becoming the woman who raised Anna. This knowledge created fractures in Anna's identity. She was Mamluk and Armenian both. She was privileged and product of exploitation simultaneously. She belonged fully to neither the community of her mother's origin nor the Mamluk elite into which she had been born. She existed in the liminal space created when systematic human acquisition produces children who embody the merger of captor and captive populations. When Anna reached marriageable age, her father arranged her marriage to another Mamluk officer's son. This was standard practice for daughters of the military elite. The marriage was comfortable. Her husband treated her with respect. She bore 3 children. Her life was externally indistinguishable from any other woman of her social rank. But she carried her mother's story. She knew the transformation chambers. She knew the markets. She knew the systematic nature of acquisition and processing because her mother had described it with the clinical precision of someone who had survived by understanding every detail of the system. And when Anna's daughter reached adolescence and began asking questions about her grandmother's origins, Anna had to decide what to tell her. She could sanitize the story, present it as tragic but distant history. Or she could explain the truth, that their family existed because a complex system of military expansion and human acquisition had seized her mother and processed her through transformation facilities before selling her to Anna's father. Anna told the truth. She felt her daughter deserved to know, but the telling damaged something between them. Her daughter looked at her differently afterward, saw her as the product of violence rather than simply as mother. The knowledge created the same fracture in the next generation that Anna herself had carried. This was the generational effect. The Mamluk system did not simply affect the women who were captured. It affected their children, and their children's children. It created families whose very existence emerged from systematic exploitation, families who could never fully escape the circumstances of their origin. By the 15th century, Damascus and Cairo contained thousands of families with similar origins. The Christian population of Syria had been so thoroughly integrated into Mamluk society that distinct Christian communities had largely dissolved. Some families maintained Christian identity through careful private practice. Others converted fully to Islam. Many existed in the ambiguous middle space where their ancestors' origins were known but no longer actively acknowledged. The system had achieved its objective. Christian communities that might have resisted Mamluk rule had been systematically absorbed into the population. The acquisition and transformation of women had, over generations, eliminated alternative sources of loyalty and identity. What military conquest began, systematic human acquisition completed. The infrastructure that enabled this system was vast and sophisticated. Understanding its full scope requires looking beyond individual stories to the administrative apparatus that made such systematic processing possible. The Damascus Citadel complex included not only processing chambers, but also medical facilities where acquisitions were examined for communicable diseases, training wings where transformation procedures were implemented, housing for instructors like Safia who had themselves been products of the system, administrative offices where transactions were recorded, storage for the documented records that tracked every acquisition, training outcome, placement, and subsequent transfer. This infrastructure was replicated across every major Mamluk city. Cairo's system was even more extensive than Damascus's. Secondary cities like Aleppo and Alexandria maintained smaller but functional facilities. The coordination between these sites was documented. acquisitions could be transferred between cities based on demand. Premium acquisitions from Damascus processing centers were sometimes sent to Cairo for specialized training. Women who proved difficult to place in one market were transferred to others. The economic scale was enormous. Contemporary records suggest that the acquisition and processing system generated revenue comparable to the textile trade in its importance to the Mamluk economy. Prices ranged from 50 dirhams for damaged goods to over 1,000 dirhams for premium acquisitions. With thousands of women processed annually during periods of military expansion, the total economic activity was substantial. The system also served military purposes beyond simple revenue generation. Distribution of captive women to soldiers was a form of payment that supplemented monetary compensation. Officers could select captives as reward for military success. This created incentive structures that encouraged aggressive prosecution of campaigns into Christian territories. The promise of human acquisition motivated military action. Legal frameworks supported every aspect of the system. Islamic jurisprudence regarding prisoners of war and slavery provided the foundational legitimacy. Mamluk administrators developed supplementary regulations that specified procedures, rights of various parties, obligations of owners, and conditions for manumission. These legal structures were not merely theoretical. They were actively enforced through religious courts and administrative oversight. The psychology that enabled mass participation in this system is perhaps the most disturbing element to examine. Tens of thousands of individual Mamluks participated, officers who made selections in processing centers, soldiers who made purchases in markets, administrators who maintained the records, guards who prevented escapes, instructors who implemented transformation procedures, household members who supervised daily labor. These were not monsters. They were ordinary people operating within a system that had normalized human acquisition through institutional practice and legal sanction. They viewed their participation as normal commercial activity. They could purchase women in markets the same way they purchased livestock or textiles, because the system had made such transactions routine. This normalization was achieved through several mechanisms. Religious justification provided moral cover. Economic incentives made participation profitable. Legal frameworks made everything procedurally correct. Social acceptance removed stigma, and the systematic nature of the entire apparatus created psychological distance between participants and the human reality of their actions. The guard who returned Marguerite to isolation after her escape attempt was not personally invested in her suffering. He was performing his assigned function within an institutional structure. The administrator who recorded Catherine's sale to Kalawun's household was completing bureaucratic paperwork. The merchant Rashid who trained Eleanor for premium sale was managing inventory. None of them had to confront the full human horror of the system, because the system parceled out responsibility into discrete tasks that seemed, in isolation, merely professional duties. This is how systematic oppression operates at scale. Not through continuous cruelty by sadistic individuals, but through institutional structures that make horror routine and distribute responsibility so thoroughly that no single participant bears psychologically crushing weight. The Mamluks were not unique in this. They were simply highly competent at building and maintaining such systems. Their military and administrative genius, which allowed them to defeat Mongol invasions and control vital trade routes, was the same genius they applied to human acquisition and transformation. The efficiency was the same. The record-keeping was the same. The systematic thinking was the same. The legacy of this system extended far beyond its operational period. When Mamluk power ended with the Ottoman conquest in 1517, the infrastructure was dismantled, but the effects persisted. The Christian communities of Syria never recovered their pre-Mamluk population levels or territorial extent. Entire towns that had been Christian majority became Muslim majority through the generational effects of systematic acquisition. Family lines were permanently altered. Cultural practices were lost. Languages disappeared. Genetic studies of modern Levantine populations show evidence of extensive population mixing during the Mamluk period. This genetic legacy is the biological record of systematic acquisition and transformation. Every woman who bore children within the system contributed to permanent population change. The DNA of modern Damascus contains traces of Armenian, Frankish, and Greek ancestry, introduced through processes that contemporary observers would prefer to forget. The erasure attempt was systematic as well. Later historians, both Muslim and European, tended to minimize or romanticize what occurred. The harem became a fantasy of Orientalist imagination, rather than a realistic examination of how such institutions actually functioned. The slave markets became sanitized references in historical texts rather than detailed analysis of systematic human trafficking. The transformation centers disappeared from popular historical narrative entirely. This erasure served psychological purposes for later generations. Acknowledging the full systematic nature of what occurred would require confronting uncomfortable questions about how sophisticated societies manage conquest and about how ordinary people participate in institutional oppression. Easier to focus on battles and treaties, on sultans and military campaigns, than on the processing centers and training chambers where systematic transformation destroyed and rebuilt human identities. But the records survived. Administrative documents, court records, purchase receipts, training manuals, private correspondence. The Mamluks' own bureaucratic thoroughness preserved evidence that later generations preferred to ignore. Recent scholarship has begun examining these sources with less sentimentality. The systematic nature is becoming clear. The scale is becoming understood. The individual stories are emerging from archival silence. We return now to Catherine of Acre, kneeling on wet stone in a Damascus processing chamber, waiting to discover which door would determine her fate. When Emir Tashdamur gestured her toward the right door, Catherine stood and walked toward it with steady steps. She did not know what awaited beyond that door. She only knew that a decision had been made about her future by someone who had assessed her with the same calculation applied to military logistics. The right door led to 12 years of systematic exploitation, but it also led to survival, to eventual manumission, to decades of life that might have been stolen entirely if she had been assigned to the left door or the center door instead. Her education, which seemed such a terrible liability when her father's compound in Acre was overrun, became the skill that preserved her through the systematic transformation process. She lived to age 63, dying in Damascus in 1315. She never returned to Acre. The Crusader territories had been conquered permanently by the time she gained her freedom, but she maintained contact with the few remaining Christian communities in Damascus. She taught young women to read and write, passing on skills that might otherwise have been lost. She lived a quiet life of minimal means and maximal dignity. Her story was neither purely tragedy nor simple survival. It was complex truth. She was destroyed in many ways by what the system did to her. She was also shaped by it into someone who could navigate that system and eventually escape its absolute control. Both things are true simultaneously. The thousands of other women whose stories paralleled hers in various details faced similar complexity. Isabella, cooking meals for the family that had destroyed hers. Eleanor, playing the oud in elite gatherings while remembering her father's death. Marguerite, maintaining hope against reality for decades. Anna, raising her own children while carrying her mother's transformation as part of her identity. None of their stories fit comfortable categories. They were not passive victims awaiting rescue. They were not willing participants in their own exploitation. They were human beings trapped in systematic structures that gave them limited options and forced them to make impossible choices from among terrible alternatives. What happened to them was calculated policy, not random violence. It was administered through sophisticated infrastructure, not spontaneous chaos. It was legally sanctioned, economically integrated, and socially normalized. This makes it more disturbing, not less. Systematic oppression implemented with administrative competence is more horrifying than disorganized atrocity precisely because it demonstrates how easily societies can make horror routine. The Mamluk acquisition system was one expression of this human capacity for systematic horror. It was not the only such system in history. It was not even unique to its time period, but it was documented with unusual thoroughness, and those documents survive to force confrontation with uncomfortable truths about conquest, power, and what societies are capable of when they apply organizational genius to human exploitation. These women existed. Their suffering was real. Their names were recorded in sources that official histories preferred to exclude. Telling their stories is not sensationalism, it is acknowledgement. It is resistance to the erasure that the system's designers would have preferred. It is insistence that the victims of systematic oppression deserve to be remembered as individuals with names, histories, and the same human complexity that everyone carries. Catherine of Acre, Isabella of Tripoli, Eleanor of Antioch, Marguerite of Jerusalem, Anna of Damascus, and the thousands whose names were not preserved but whose existence shaped the world we inherited. They deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told without the comfortable distance that sanitizes atrocity into abstract historical process. What was done to them was done by people, systematic people, administrative people, efficient people. Understanding this is essential because the capacity for systematic horror did not end with the Mamluk Sultanate. It remains part of what human societies can do when they combine organizational competence with moral permission and institutional structure. The lesson is not that the past was uniquely terrible. The lesson is that systematic oppression requires systematic infrastructure, and that infrastructure requires ordinary people willing to perform their assigned functions without confronting the cumulative horror their participation enables. If you found this examination valuable, if you believe these stories deserve to be known without sanitization or comfortable distance, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment with your location so we can understand how far this history reaches. And stay for the next video, where we will examine another systematic structure that history preferred to forget, but that documentary evidence refuses to let us ignore. These voices deserve to be heard. These stories deserve to be told. The comfortable narratives that exclude such systematic horror are false narratives. The truth is harder, but necessary. Remember their names.